Welcome to the debate. Today we are looking at a culturally ubiquitous phrase. It's one that almost everyone has heard or said or maybe even feared at some point in their lives.
Right, once a cheater, always a cheater.
Exactly. Once a cheater, always a cheater. And we are diving deeply into a vast collection of clinical case studies, psychological analyses of relationship dynamics, and research on trust to figure out if this phrase is actually a factual, reliable rule of human behavior, or if it's, just a reductive myth.
It's a heavy topic.
It really is. And I want to frame this using a concept from structural engineering, actually, the stress test. So imagine a massive concrete bridge that has stood for years, and suddenly a visible crack appears in one of the primary support beams.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right. So to the untrained eye, it is just a crack. But to the engineer, it prompts an existential question. Was this crack the result of a highly specific, unprecedented load limit being temporarily exceeded? Or is the concrete itself fundamentally rotten, meaning that a total collapse is just a matter of time?
That is a terrifying question to have to ask.
Truly. And I will be arguing that the phrase, once a cheater, always a cheater, is a myth because it essentially assumes every crack is rot. I believe people and the specific circumstances that govern their choices can and do fundamentally change. I mean, we can reinforce the beams.
And I will be arguing that the phrase, while, perhaps not an immutable law of physics, is a highly accurate heuristic for survival. It is generally true. The terrifying part of your structural equation is that from the outside, the crack looks exactly the same either way.
Well, that's true, yeah.
Right? You can patch it, you can paint over it, you can pretend the bridge is safe, but if the rot is in the foundation, putting more weight on that bridge is an active choice to court disaster. Cheating is not simply a momentary mistake. It's a behavior that reveals deep-seated character traits regarding deception and self-preservation. I come at it from the perspective that human psychology is frankly far less cooperative than concrete, and those internal traits are incredibly resistant to change.
Let me begin by establishing exactly why treating this phrase as a universal law is so problematic. It treats infidelity as a monolith. It assumes that every single act of betrayal stems from the exact same dark, malicious corner of the human psyche.
But the impact is monolithic, isn't it?
The impact on the victim, absolutely. But the clinical data we are looking at sharply contradicts the idea that the motivation is monolithic. Cheating often stems from highly specific and, importantly, highly fixable breakdowns in a person's life. Consider the case study of the individual who cheated at 22 years old.
Oh, right, the college age study?
Yes, at that age, biologically and psychologically, we are often looking at profound immaturity. The prefrontal cortex, which governs long-term consequence evaluation, it's barely finished forming. You have a sheer lack of understanding regarding the collateral emotional damage of your actions.
And usually a complete inability to communicate complex emotional needs, too.
Exactly. So in this case, the individual failed terribly. The relationship ended. But then they entered rigorous therapy. They genuinely grew up. Years later, in a completely different relationship, that behavior never repeated. To say always a cheater permanently brands them and denies the core mechanism of human psychological development.
I hear that.
It suggests that if the underlying issues are addressed, real growth is just impossible. I argue that when the root cause is resolved, the symptom, which in this case was infidelity, does not return.
I am certainly not denying the basic human capacity for growth, nor am I suggesting that a 22-year-old is permanently logged into the absolute worst choice they made in college. But I maintain that the saying is a vital protective reality for a reason. We have to look at what the specific act of cheating actually requires of a person's brain.
Okay, break that down for me.
Infidelity is not a passive accident. You don't trip and fall into a prolonged affair. It is a highly revealing diagnostic test of how a person handles temptation, how they process their own guilt, and crucially, how much respect they have for a partner when nobody is watching.
But doesn't everyone fail diagnostic tests at some point in their lives? We all fail.
They do, but the repair process for this specific failure is monumental. True change requires intensely difficult, intentional work to dismantle and rebuild broken internal mechanisms. We use the phrase doing the work so casually now, but what does that actually mean?
Right. It's become a bit of a buzzword.
Exactly. Realistically, it means experiencing a kind of ego death. It means sitting in a therapist's office and admitting that you are profoundly selfish, tracing that back to your own insecurities, and daily, painfully choosing vulnerability over validation. The reality of human nature is that the vast majority of people simply skip that difficult work.
Because it's agonizing.
Because it hurts too much. They feel terrible, they cry, they apologize, but they do not restructure their psychological foundation. And because they skip the foundational work, the pattern of deception almost always repeats the moment they feel underappreciated again.
I see why you think that, but I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because you are still categorizing all infidelity as an embedded pattern of deception, rather than allowing for the isolated breakdown. You just mentioned the sheer mechanics of cheating, what it requires of a person's brain. Let's unpack that. What exactly are you arguing it requires?
It requires a staggering capacity for compartmentalization. Think of it like a computer running a massive hidden operating system in the background.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right? Lying isn't just a passive state. It requires active, continuous mental processing. You have to remember the false timeline you established. You have to monitor what your partner knows. You have to delete the right messages, all while managing the emotional energy of two separate lives.
It's exhausting just hearing about it.
It drains your psychological battery entirely. It is a sustained campaign of behavior. It requires looking a trusting partner directly in the eye, asking, "How was your day?" and actively maintaining a false reality. Sometimes this goes on for weeks, sometimes for months.
Yeah.
The fact that an individual can run that malicious software in the background without their conscience shutting the whole system down demonstrates a pre-existing comfort with dishonesty. Most people do not possess the psychological stomach to lie to someone they love day after day. If an individual can do that, the capacity for profound deception was already deeply rooted in their character.
That's an incredible way to visualize it, honestly, the background operating system. But let me push back on that exact metaphor by looking at the evidence regarding self-reporting.
Okay.
Consider this scenario of a partner who cheats exactly once. It's a moment of weakness and isolated failure. But instead of booting up that hidden operating system you just described, the system immediately crashes.
Because the guilt is too heavy.
Yes. They come clean entirely on their own 24 hours later. They do not wait to get caught. They do not maintain a false narrative for months. Doesn't the very act of self-reporting immediately demonstrate a fundamental overriding accountability that shatters the whole comfortable with deception thesis?
Well,
if they were truly comfortable with deception, they would have simply hidden the transgression. Their immediate confession proves the act was an aberration rather than a foundational character trait.
that is a compelling distinction, and I will grant that the immediate self-reporter is a different breed than the calculated long-term deceiver. But have you considered the contrasting reality that shows up constantly in clinical settings?
Which one?
The individual who made one mistake, confessed, showed immense remorse, cried, begged for forgiveness, and convinced their partner to stay. They look exactly like your self-reporter.
Oh, wait, I know where this is going.
Yep, only for the partner to discover 14 months later that it wasn't an isolated incident at all. It was a parallel relationship that had been running the entire time, and the confession was just a strategic release of a little bit of truth because they suspected they were about to be caught.
Wow. Yeah.
The remorse looked identical in both situations. The tears were just as wet, the apologies were just as loud. You ask if self-reporting shows accountability. Perhaps it does in that rare, pure instance. But for every genuine self-reporter, there is someone who uses the appearance of remorse as just another layer of deception.
That is devastating.
It is. And this is why the heuristic exists. We are asked to distinguish between someone who made a terrible choice and feels genuine, crushing guilt versus someone who is fundamentally comfortable with deception and is only sorry that the optimal conditions for their deceit have been compromised.
And I agree that telling the difference from the outside is incredibly difficult, almost impossible sometimes. But this is exactly why we have to categorize the why behind the infidelity.
Okay, let's look at the why.
The motivation behind the act dictates the likelihood of a repeat offense. If we just say they cheated, they are a cheater forever, we learn absolutely nothing about how to prevent it or heal from it. When you look at the clinical data, you start seeing very distinct patterns, highly remediable types of infidelity. Let's look at two specific mechanisms.
Go ahead.
First, the person whose relationship has been clinically dead for years. There is no communication, no intimacy, no connection. They are emotionally starving. Then, a coworker simply asks them a thoughtful question, and suddenly they feel seen for the first time in a decade. It blossoms into a horrible choice. Now, let's be clear, it is an entirely maladaptive coping mechanism, and it is a profound betrayal.
A huge betrayal, yes.
But it is driven by a circumstantial deficit, not a lifelong love of deception.
And the second type?
The second is a person with a severe avoidance problem. Let's translate maladaptive coping mechanism into reality here. This person is physiologically incapable of having hard conversations. The thought of sitting their partner down and saying, "I am unhappy and I want to leave," makes them feel like they are going to literally die.
So they just avoid it completely.
Right. So rather than initiating a breakup, they act out. They start an affair, consciously or subconsciously, as a detonation device. They blow up the relationship from the outside to force an exit without having to be the one to initiate the hard conversation.
It's incredibly cowardly.
It's cowardly, yes, but it's not a permanent character trait of malicious deceit. It is a severe conflict resolution deficit. Both the emotionally starving partner and the avoidant partner have clear, identifiable psychological mechanisms that can be unpacked, understood, and resolved in therapy.
I understand the clinical categorizations, and I accept that those two specific profiles exist. But categorizing them doesn't magically make the risk acceptable to the person who has to trust them again. And more importantly, you're conveniently leaving out the third type prominently featured in our analysis.
The entitlement profile?
Exactly. The entitlement profile. The individual who genuinely does not respect monogamy but flat out refuses to articulate that reality.
Right, because they want the benefits.
Exactly. Because they want the safety, the warmth, and the social utility of a committed partner at home, right alongside the total freedom of being single. They want to have their cake and eat it too. For this type of person, they do not actually believe what they are doing is morally wrong. They don't have an avoidant conflict resolution deficit. They aren't emotionally starving.
They're just selfish.
They are simply maximizing their own pleasure at the expense of someone else's reality. Their only regret is the inconvenience of being discovered. For this third type, once a cheater, always a cheater is an absolute undeniable reality. Their belief system is fundamentally misaligned with the contract of the relationship, and no amount of therapy for avoidance is going to fix a core entitlement issue.
I actually agree with you completely regarding that third type. If someone fundamentally views fidelity as optional and empathy as a weakness, the phrase is a reality. But that leaves us with a huge problem.
Which is?
How does a partner distinguish between the person who used infidelity as a detonation device because they were terrified of conflict and the person who just feels entitled to multiple lives? If we can see that the first two types can be rehabilitated with real work, we cannot ethically apply a blanket condemnation to everyone.
See, I think we apply the blanket condemnation as a protective heuristic precisely because it is nearly impossible to verify which category someone falls into until it is far too late. The burden of proof is the crux of this entire debate.
You mean the risk is just too high?
Way too high. Because you cannot verify if someone has genuinely changed their underlying psychology until you are already deeply invested and vulnerable again. Walking away is almost always the safer, more rational choice. We have to look at the psychological trauma inflicted on the victim.
It's immense.
Cheating deeply impacts the betrayed partner. They are left to spend years agonizing over whether they, weren't enough. They internalize the betrayal as a reflection of their own worth, when in reality, the infidelity was entirely about the perpetrator's internal flaws. Given that devastating psychological toll, asking a victim to stick around, to play detective, to wait and see if their partner is the fixable avoidant or the incurable cake eater is an absurd expectation. There's a victim quoted in our material who states powerfully, "I'm not your lesson, I'm your warning." That captures it perfectly.
I want to pause here because if someone listening right now is actively trying to rebuild their relationship after a betrayal, This conversation could feel incredibly discouraging. I agree unequivocally that the victim is never at fault. Any framing that blames a victim for staying, suggesting that they somehow showed the cheater there are no consequences, is just abhorrent.
Agreed, completely.
The cheater is solely responsible for the betrayal, but let's look at the flip side of this heuristic. I argue that society unfairly sabotages genuine reconciliation when couples actually attempt to do the necessary work.
How does society sabotage it?
By refusing to allow the bridge to be repaired. Imagine a scenario where a couple endures the absolute crucible of healing. The offending partner does the intensive therapy. True accountability is established. They rebuild the foundation brick by brick. Yet friends and family constantly bring up the past, weaponizing it at every dinner party or group event.
Ha! The whispering.
Yes. The underlying cultural whisper is always, well, you know what they did. If the couple has genuinely done the rigorous work to repair the foundation, shouldn't we as observers allow trust to be rebuilt rather than demanding a permanent public punishment? Society enforces the always a cheater myth by refusing to acknowledge when rehabilitation has actually occurred.
But society's skepticism is earned. It's not invented out of thin air. And honestly, rebuilding trust isn't really about a community letting go of a grudge. It isn't even just about the betrayed person trusting the offending partner again. The darkest, most difficult part of rebuilding trust is that the betrayed person must rebuild trust in their own judgment.
Right, because their alarm system failed.
Exactly. They looked at a liar and saw an honest person. Their internal compass told them they were safe when they were actually in danger. So as they attempt reconciliation, they are going to be hyper-vigilant. And this is where the theory of doing the work hits the reality of a random Tuesday night.
Okay, paint the picture for me.
Let's say the offending partner's phone buzzes at 9 p.m. The betrayed partner feels a sudden spike of adrenaline. A panic attack starts brewing. What does genuine patience look like in that moment?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that adrenaline spike is real.
Right? If the cheating partner exhibits even a fraction of defensive behavior, if they sigh heavily, if they roll their eyes, if they say, "It's just work, you just need to trust me now," it proves the remorse is entirely fake.
It has to be radical patience.
Real remorse requires immense, theoretically infinite patience. The offending partner has to say, "I see you are anxious. Here is my phone. Take all the time you need." The fact that defensive annoyance is the standard human response rather than radical patience is exactly why society remains skeptical. The work is just too hard for most people to sustain.
If someone listening right now is trying to rebuild, hearing that defensiveness means the remorse is fake has to be terrifying, but it highlights the stakes, which brings up a highly practical application from the material. What happens when this isn't about repairing a broken relationship, but starting a new one?
The blank slate scenario.
Yes. How do we evaluate historical infidelity in the context of a completely fresh start? Imagine you find out that a new partner, whom you have been dating happily for 3 months, cheated in a past relationship 5 years ago. They are open about it. They claim they went through the difficult process, learned their terrible lesson, and have fundamentally changed.
That's a tough spot to be in.
I argue that to apply the always a cheater heuristic here, holding someone forever hostage to a past version of themselves closes the door on recognizing real human evolution. If they were young, if the context was entirely different, treating them as a perpetual risk denies the reality that people do outgrow their worst mistakes. Do we permanently brand them with a scarlet letter?
It isn't a scarlet letter. It's a flashing yellow light in an intersection. Intense caution is not the same thing as holding someone hostage. If you discover this history 3 months in, the only logical response is to drastically slow down. You do not truly know this person yet.
So you pump the brakes.
You absolutely pump the brakes. Protecting oneself isn't the same as punishing the other person for their past. Real, genuine change is robust. It can survive skepticism, it can survive a new partner taking their time, pumping the brakes, and requiring more evidence of character before extending total vulnerability. If the person has truly changed, they will understand exactly why that caution is necessary. They won't feel punished. They'll feel understood.
And if they don't?
If they act insulted by the caution or say, "You're judging me for my past," well, that defensiveness tells you they haven't actually changed at all.
That is a very fair distinction, that real change can withstand scrutiny. As we draw our analysis to a close today, my position remains that once a cheater, always a cheater is fundamentally a myth. It is a myth because it denies the biological and psychological reality of human growth. Yes, genuine transformation is rare. We've established that it requires immense, often agonizing effort to excavate the ego, address the root causes of destructive behavior, and build new neural pathways for empathy and communication.
It's an uphill battle.
But it happens. People do learn how to have hard conversations instead of dropping detonation devices. People do outgrow the profound selfishness of their early 20s. Writing off every single person who has ever failed in this specific way is an overly cynical approach to the human condition. It assumes that our worst moments permanently calcify our character, and the clinical evidence simply does not support that level of fatalism. We can reinforce the bridge.
And I maintain that while the phrase might not be an absolute, inescapable law of nature, it remains a necessary, highly accurate heuristic for navigating the dangers of human relationships. Cheating is a unique violation because it tells you exactly who someone was and what they were capable of in a moment of pressure.
Yeah.
It demonstrates a capacity to prioritize selfish desires over a partner's psychological safety while looking them directly in the eye and running that hidden operating system. Because true foundational accountability, the kind that literally rewires a personality, is so exceptionally rare, the deep skepticism inherent in the phrase is entirely justified. The odds of a repeat offense are high because, frankly, most people prefer the comfort of moving on to the agonizing pain of looking inward.
I think we have arrived at a vital point of convergence today. Whether you view the phrase as a myth or a protective shield, the clinical material points us to one critical, undeniable takeaway. Feeling bad is not the same as doing the work. Guilt is simply an emotion. Accountability is a sustained action.
That is the core truth right there.
Right. The only question that ultimately matters, whether you are assessing a current partner attempting reconciliation or a new partner with a checkered past, is whether the actual thinking and the core belief system that led to the choice in the first place are fundamentally different now.
Precisely. If the underlying mindset hasn't shifted, if they are still avoidant or still secretly entitled, the behavior is just waiting for the right trigger, the right amount of stress or temptation to resurface.
Which brings us back to our structural stress test. A crack in the foundation doesn't necessarily mean the building must be demolished today. But ignoring the crack or assuming a fresh coat of paint will hold the concrete together is an incredibly dangerous game. Analyzing the precise psychological mechanisms behind infidelity, the why and the how, offers us far more value than relying on surface-level cliches.
Absolutely.
The material we explored today holds even deeper nuances regarding human behavior, and we leave it to you, the listener, to evaluate your own thresholds for trust, risk, and redemption. So if the stress test fails, do you put in the grueling work to reinforce the beams, or do you walk away before the collapse? Thank you for joining us on The Debate.